Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called The Plotter Approach to Writing, and joining me on the show for a conversation about this topic is Megan Davidhizar. Hey, Megan.
Hey, great to be here.
How are you?
Doing okay.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to chat all things plotting with you, but before we dive into that, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey as an author so far.
Yeah, so I started writing pretty late, actually. I was not one of those kids who always grew up, knew she wanted to be a writer. I teach high school English, and about 7 years ago, challenged my students with a writing assignment that I decided I should try to also do myself. And became my first book idea, which I wrote and learned a lot, and it failed miserably in the query trenches, as it should have. And I wrote another fantasy and it did even worse in the trenches. And so then I tried switching it up and wrote a YA thriller. And that got me into Pitch Wars, a mentorship program that is now gone by the wayside. And through that showcase, I secured my agent, and she was able to sell my book in a two-book deal. And the first one comes out in August 6th, and then the next one will hopefully come out the next year. We'll see how my revisions go.
Congratulations, that's so exciting. I'm so happy for you.
Thanks.
And I think it's really cool too how you switch genres because I did a similar thing. My first book was a young adult mystery, my second one was a young adult speculative thriller, and the one that got me an agent was a YA fantasy. So we were like backwards.
Yeah. Wow. I props to the fantasy because that is so much more challenging, I think, with the world building.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, for sure. Well, I'm so excited to dive into plotting, but first, I just wanted to acknowledge that there are many ways to approach writing a story. There are plotters, there are pantsers, and then there are people in the middle. And so, for anyone listening who is not a plotter, I see you. I actually wasn't a plotter my entire writing journey, so I totally feel what it's like to be a pantser or a plantser. And so I totally recognize that there are other writing styles out there. And I think it's really cool because if you think about it, no matter if somebody is a plotter, pantser, or planter, somewhere in between, we all end up with finished manuscripts. And I think that's really, really cool. So when you started writing, were you always a plotter or did that come later?
I think it came after I learned more about story structure. I wrote scenes out of order because I felt like I always had to be adding to my word count. And so if I got stuck, I would just jump to a different part in the story that I knew was going to happen. And then I tried to figure out what needed to go in the middle of that. And then once I read Save the Cat and learned more about those story beats with my next book, I tried to really plan it out. And that has definitely been something that I go back to. And I like to just sort of refresh and like read about those. And it helps me think through different elements of my story or what something might be missing as I'm trying to fill in some gaps.
Yeah, that's fantastic. When I started, I was more of a planter where I had like my major plot points figured out, but with the chapters in between them, I kind of pants that. And when I did this for my first two books, what I found was I had a lot of sagging parts of the plot where I was just kind of meandering and doing all these things that weren't necessary to the main story, and I ended up having to cut a lot. And my first two, when I finished the drafts and started getting into the revisions, they were way over word count. And so I had to do all the cutting and everything. And so when I did my two young adult fantasies, I plotted, and I actually did them during NaNoWriMo, and so I planned a lot, I plotted a lot, and then I drafted both the entire manuscript during November, and both hit around 73,000, which is a lot of words in 1 month, but I found, like, by plotting and having a detailed chapter by chapter outline, I was always able to stay on track, and it wasn't like I was stalling to figure out what to write because I had a plan for myself.
That's really interesting because I definitely consider myself an underwriter. So when I have my first drafts, even with my plots, if I crack 40,000, I'm like, yes, killing it. And then I always have to go back in, and I tend to be really thin on character development because I'm more focused on plot. And that's something that I'm working through right now is shaping my characters more with the plot points that I have. And I'm really wishing that I would have spent more time plotting my character arcs, not necessarily with my main character. I had that one down, but with even those side characters to give them that depth and having that planned out in advance too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I completely relate to you. And I just want to say, too, that with the two drafts hitting a 73K, that's a little low for YA fantasy. So, with the plotting, like, I definitely agree that you can be a little low on the word count. But what you just mentioned there is that it gives you room to expand. It's not like you're trying to cut stuff, it's giving you room to expand and do the character development because I'm definitely the same way where I'm very focused on the story. And it's really interesting because when people think of plotting, they think of the story beats and the actions in the story, but you're exactly right to mention that the characterization comes into that as well. And so I really like how you mentioned that you're trying to focus more on character development in the plotting stage to work those arcs in more along with the plot. But I'm definitely the same where I feel like part of it too isn't necessarily like not plotting the characters in advance. Part of it for me is more of I have to actually write the characters in order to discover who they are and the little details about them that you can't really discover during the plotting stage. So I think that's why I have to do more character development later because I discover who my characters are while I draft, and then I can go back and strengthen their characterization and their arcs when I revise.
Yeah, I think there's kind of this, I don't know if I would call it a myth, but this maybe assumption that if you plot, then it's not as much revision. And I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that. At least I
No.
haven't reached there yet,
Mm-mm.
but I think it's a different kind of revision.
Yeah.
I do think that I tend to have, even in this book that I'm working on right now, my editor asked me to cut one of the point of views, which was definitely a major, yeah,
Oh.
major structural rewrite, and she asked me to move basically my, if we went in 3-act structure, basically my second half of the second act to become the first half of the
Oh,
second act.
man, wow.
So, I had to take everything apart, but I still knew my midpoint was gonna be my midpoint. I still knew where I was gonna end up at the end, and so keeping those, like, tent poles of the story, I feel like still helped me have those anchors.
Oh, yeah, for sure, and you're exactly right. If you plot, you do have to do revisions. That's not
Yeah.
like you don't get a pass of, like, not doing revisions, but I do think that when you plot, you have cleaner drafts, and so I think for me personally, when I go to do revisions and I get feedback, because my drafts are cleaner than if I pant them, it's easier to pin down what changes need to be made instead of having to
Mhm.
clean up a bunch of inconsistency messes and just parts of the story that don't belong there at all. You kind of eliminate all of those things if you plot in advance, but there are definitely revisions that need to be made no matter what.
Yeah. So if anybody's listening to this and they're, like, thinking, "Oh, I'm having so much trouble with the revisions, maybe plotting would solve all of my problems." I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think that's the case.
Yeah. So, what are your plotting techniques for getting ready, getting your outline ready before you start drafting?
Well, one thing that has so far worked for me with my thrillers is I think of my twist first, so I know my ending, and then I have to think about what situation would get my characters there for my beginning. And then I tend to go with my midpoint and what's going to, be my flip there. And then I start thinking more about the into break into the second act, break into the third act, and build up of the climax. So yeah, I start with my end, beginning, then middle, and then figure out the little things in between.
Yeah, I would say we have a similar process. I think it's important for me to know the end because when it gets into foreshadowing and all the
Yeah.
subplots kind of going their own ways and then intertwining, I think by knowing how everything resolves, you can kind of establish things and drop hints. And I think so too about plotting a thriller, especially. Like, I write fantasy and thriller, and I just finished plotting a thriller recently that it's like a locked room thriller, and I'm really, really excited to start drafting it. But when I did that outline, I would really struggle, I think, to draft this period if I didn't have an outline because then I would need to know in advance, like all the backstories, all the motivations of,
Mhm.
why this is going on in the story with the thriller aspect and, knowing how all the characters are intertwined because it's like a locked room thriller and they're all there for a reason. And if I didn't know all of that in advance, it'd be really, really hard to make the story work and figure out where to reveal things, where to put the twists in, because when you know the end and you know what you're working toward, then you can weave all of that in rather than discovering it as you go and then having to go back and figure out how to drop all the hints.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I've heard some of my friends who are pantsers describe it. Like I've got one, she's got a book coming out, Original Twin, and I read it for her before it was sold, and she said that she literally didn't know who the killer was either until like is revealed to the reader, and she got to that
How?
point, and then she goes back and kind of adds some of those twists in, and it's
Wow.
fascinating to me that somebody's mind can work that way because she's just as amazed that
Oh, that's
I
cool.
can think it through, from the beginning. It's just like it's
Okay.
one's not right or wrong. They truly are just different.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. That's really, really interesting. But another point I wanted to make, and I'm curious to see what you think about this too, is just because we plot in advance, that doesn't mean that we lose out on the discovery aspect of the
Mm,
drafting stage. Because for me, especially when I'm drafting, even though I'm following an outline, my characters will surprise me and my plot will surprise me. So I'm having to deviate a little bit from my initial outline from time to time. And I always have something to go back to get back on track. But just because I have an outline, I'm not opposed to going in directions I never imagined because I feel like the magic still happens when you're drafting and getting into those characters and into the story. And so I never restrict myself with an outline. I kind of see it more of a guide if I get stuck and something to follow.
yeah, I don't think that I've made major deviations based on character changes, but I would say that character is something that I have to work really intentionally for. Um, in my revisions, as opposed to some people talk about their characters sort of like speak to them. I haven't really had that experience. But I do think that for me, like, I love plotting so much that I get, like, a little writer's high from thinking through and, putting more into my outline, and in fact, I have started really kind of making my outline into a 0 draft, where I'll put each beat into its chapter and just sort of have even a couple of lines, and then I just write a little bit more about that, and then I go to the next one and I write a little bit more about that, and so instead of drafting it from beginning to end, I find myself kind of going through the outline multiple times and adding a little bit more detail each time before it really even takes shape into full scenes.
I love that. I love that so much. I think what you're doing too is allowing yourself to revisit it multiple times and see the holes that you need to fill. And I do a similar thing where I don't do the 0 draft thing where I have like the chapters separate. I just have like an outline. It's broken into chapters with small paragraphs. So I don't think I do as detailed as you. I kind of just have like little paragraphs of like the actions of the scenes and like what plot points are to happen and any character development points because I feel like I want to not develop it too much to kind of take away from the imagination stage of the drafting, but I definitely do go through like multiple times because I think whenever you start to add more things to the outline and you start to see the story develop, then you can go back and see, okay, the connection between this chapter and this chapter, there's something missing, that transition isn't there. Or with a thriller, like nothing really thriller-esque, nobody got killed yet, or
Yeah.
no clues were dropped yet. We gotta like, hit those points. And so I think it's a really great way to zero in on the genre expectations and making sure that not only your plot and characters are working, but also whatever genre you're writing, and making sure you have the conventions worked in as well.
Yeah, I feel like that was really important for my book that's coming out in August, Silent Sister, because it follows two girls who are disappear on a class trip, and they're sisters. And when one of them returns without any memory of what happened, she has to put together the clues. But the story's told from one sister's point of view before they disappear, and then the other sister's point of view after. And so it sort of is like the ending of the present point of view is technically the midpoint of the story. And so thinking through that outline, it's like I pictured like a ribbon kind of being folded back on itself, because even though it's all one story, I had to hit those different beats in each point of view and have them merge together. And I just don't know that I could have done that without the plot.
Oh, yeah, no, for sure. And I think you bring up a really great point that anytime you have a dual timeline or more than one point of view, I think it's even more important for me to do the plotting in advance, because with all that jumping around, it's almost like you have more than one story thread going at once, and you need to weave them together in a way that makes sense and make sure the plot points are lining up properly. And so, definitely, I think plotting helps a lot when you have a multiple point of view or dual point of view story. So, can you think of any cons to plotting?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's hard for me since I am so in love with it. But I don't know if it's a con, but I do hear when other people talk about their characters driving the story, I find myself wondering what that would be like and if I'm missing part of that writer experience or what could be in my stories because I don't really work that way. But I think it's not necessarily something that I can make myself do. Like, I think maybe it's best to just sort of like lean into what does work best for you and take those advantages.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I do get that thing where my characters speak to me and guide me even after I plot and I draft based on a plot. So I think that's just like a personal thing. I don't think that really
Yeah.
depends on if you plot or pants it. That's a similar thing to the people saying, like, oh, I can see scenes in my head or I can't. Can you visualize scenes in
Oh,
your head or no?
I can, but I don't think I tend to that much.
I do. I like play them in my head like movies before I draft.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I think these are just like things that lean into the individual personal kind of personality and the way our brains work, because our brains are all wired differently. But I think a con, I don't know if I would call it a con either, but just something that comes to my mind with plotting is when I'm really excited about a story idea, I'm itching to write it, and because I plot so much, and
Oh.
especially with the fantasy ones, like, I do so much world building and I do a lot of research, and so I spend a ton of time and, like, have these prep docs with, like, my outline and my character notes and my research and my world building, like, everything, and it takes me a while to, like, really fully develop that to a point where I feel confident and ready to draft. And so for me, like, I feel like I'm held up a little bit. I have that excitement that I want to write it already, but I can't because I'm making myself do all this plotting that I feel like I have to do in advance. And so I guess a con for me is being excited about a story and restraining myself from diving in right away because I'm plotting.
That makes sense. Yeah, when you were talking about doing that in advance and getting excited, I could definitely see how that would hinder some things. I have found too that for myself, I am like I was the kid in class who liked to read over the rubric and make sure that I was hitting all of my points. And so I feel like I restrict myself, not in the enthusiasm like you were talking about, but sometimes in the freedom to break those structures if I need to.
Oh yeah, very good point. I think those beat sheets, like Save the Cat's really good. There's a lot of different approaches out there. I think they're really, really good. But what's really great is that I think once you understand the rules of writing, if you need to break some kind of rule for a reason and it fits your story and you have a justification for it, you definitely can do it. So I think that it's one of those things that comes with once you write a lot and you really immerse yourself in the art of stories and the plot points and the beats and all of that. And if you're writing a story that you feel you need to make some kind of deviation from a typical style for some reason, you can explore that and see what happens. I think there are some tweaks that can be made to add originality to your story because there are books out there that do that, and it's really interesting and experimental when it works.
Definitely. And whenever I come across one of those where it does work, I really try to spend some time breaking down why is it something that can be replicated? What would it take for my story to get there or not?
There are several points when I'm doing revisions, especially where I get feedback, where my beta readers or critique partners will be like, yeah, okay, I get this, but why? And if you don't have an
Mhm.
explanation for that, then that's kind of a red flag that maybe something needs tweaked there, maybe it doesn't need to be there at all. And so, because I've gotten a lot of feedback like that, especially with my earlier books. Now, when I'm plotting, I'm always asking myself, why? Like, why is this happening? And how is this contributing to the story? Why is it important? And then if you answer something specific to all those questions that you're asking yourself pertaining to the story and everything's lining up, then you know it's relevant and needed. But if you can't answer why something is necessary, then maybe you should reconsider why you have it there in the first place.
No, that's a great point. It also makes me think of with thrillers, especially like knowing what your antagonist is doing. And I don't know if anybody else has tried this, but I find it helpful to almost plot out my antagonist storyline, even though it's sort of happening in the background of my actual book, and figuring out that they're like the midpoint maybe is actually my antagonist's high climax, where they think they've got it all together.
Yeah, no, for sure. I completely agree that it's really important to know the characters as if they are starring in the story because the protagonist is the one that the readers are really getting to know. But I feel like you need to think of each character as they are the hero of their own story. And if you understand them, even if they're off the page a lot, they are contributing to the story events. And so in the plotting stage too, exploring, especially like you're saying with the antagonist, or also too for any important side characters or love interests, things like that. If you know their backstories, their goals, their motivation, and their internal and external conflict, then you can work that in while you're doing the drafting.
So much easier said than done.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I know. Like you and I are just having this whole conversation like it's cake, and it's not.
Absolutely.
So, just to wrap up, what advice do you have for anyone who has never plotted before and maybe they're considering giving it a shot?
I would definitely start with Save the Cat. It definitely helped me. Some of my other resources that I would recommend, there's another podcast called Turning to Story, and they have an early episode they call Seven Layer Plot Dip, which they have
So
some
good.
more. Yeah, pantsing brought in with that, yeah, and then there's also one that's I forget his name, but he was a screenwriter for Toy Story, and I think it's pandemoniuminc.com, and he's got an analysis basically of 3 different movies' endings and what makes them so great, and one of them is Star Wars, and he because of the endings, he goes all the way back to the beginning and shows what it is about the beginning of the movie that plays into that ending, and it really helped me especially build a good strong climax because sometimes I had this idea in my head, but I didn't know how to set up all of the right obstacles right beforehand to make it feel like it had this big payoff.
Perfect. That's fantastic. Great resources and suggestions to wrap this up. And the last point I want to make too is that if you're listening and you have not tried plotting before, give it a shot and see what happens. And if you find out that you hate it and you are a pantsing queen or king, then return to your pantsing method and stick with what works best for you, because I think, like I said at the beginning, everybody's process is different and plotting won't work for everyone. And so I think it's really important to just do what's right for you as a writer. Fantastic. Well, Megan, this brings us to the plot twist of this show where I get to ask you a fun question you could have never seen coming.
Oh no.
These are always super fun. So, for yours, what I'm going to do is give you two genres, and I want you to pair each of them with an animal mascot. So, if these genres could have mascots, what would they be? Are you ready?
Mhm. Okay, I'll do my best.
So, your two genres are thriller and fantasy.
Okay, fantasy had a mascot. Am I allowed to choose an mythical being?
Oh, yes, for sure.
Okay, because I do feel like a dragon is just the best representation. Like, if I'm gonna make a label for fantasy in my classroom library, it's gonna have a dragon on it.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, now thriller.
This is your genre, come on.
Oh, yeah, I know. Gosh, you know what? I'm gonna just go with my first instinct, which might go into that paranormal, but I was thinking a bat
Oh, real
because
good,
you've got
yeah.
dark, you've got like sharp pointy objects, you've got the association with blood coming in. So I think that that could work.
Fantastic. Well, we officially have thriller and fantasy mascots, and you can credit that to Megan. Well, it was a joy having you on the show. Can you please share with everybody where they can find you online?
Yeah, I'm just Megan Davidhizar on Twitter, on Instagram. I'm on Threads, and I am hopefully in a bookstore near you come August 6th.
Oh, I'm so excited. I will definitely be grabbing a copy of your book. I love the premise, so I'm really excited, and congratulations again.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining me on the show for such a wonderful conversation about being a plotter.
Thanks. It was lots of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listeners, that is a wrap on this chapter with Megan, all about the plotter approach to writing. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in the publishing industry you think would enjoy the show too, please pass it along to them. Thank you for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.